Welcome back everyone. I thought today we'd have a little look at how to structure a top level essay and how to really craft that strong, powerful line of argument in response to the question. So let's say for today's session, this is our question. Starting with this extract, how does Shakespeare present fate? Now, what might we do to start off our line of argument? So what really makes a good line of argument is perhaps starting with our first point about the beginning of the book or the text or the play. So perhaps our initial response to it. If it's a character or a theme, how does that character or the theme start the play or the book or the text? Then perhaps your second point moves on to the middle of the book or the text. Are there any alternative interpretations of what happened initially? Is anything added to this character? Are there any twists, any turns? And then perhaps looking at the end in our final points. Have they changed perhaps? Have they not changed? What does this mean? What is the message as a result? I guess it's kind of like a timeline, something from the beginning, the middle and the end. So for Macbeth and for this question, we could say, well, fate at the start is very much set in motion by the witches as they prophesise Macbeth's fate. So that's our first point. Perhaps our second point then moves on to the fact that other factors influence Macbeth's fate. His wife, for example, gives him quite a violent and brutal fate. Then I guess by the end, he arguably takes fate into his own hands, regardless of the prophecies and regardless of his wife, when he throws down his warlike shield and decides to attack Macduff, regardless of whether he was born of woman or not. Also, arguably, it's a tragedy, so the fate is set from the beginning, that tragic fate. So this is our progression, the beginning part, the middle part, and the end part. So a good essay structure might look something like this. We've got a strong introduction, which gives sort of general statements and a thesis point, and then the main body of our essay. And I guess the main points will sort of correspond to the beginning, the middle, and the end, like so. But I think it's also important to remember that these points don't have to be full paragraphs. You can have a few paragraphs for one point. It's not just going to end up as a 3-paragraph essay. So good to think of it in this structure. But I guess to help us remember that we're focusing on sort of like the beginning, middle and end, we could come up with a few buzzwords, perhaps initially, although and despite. Now, these could be translated into sentences like the ones that I've offered in front of you. But I guess ultimately we're presenting our initial response and then we're moving on to that alternative interpretation or different view, although initially presented like this, the character or the theme changes. And then perhaps despite initially this or despite the influence of this, by the end, this is ultimately what happens to the character. So if we have a look at some of the sentences here, we could make this even better and even clearer. So for example, we could start with, from the very outset, Shakespeare presents the brave and noble character of Macbeth who fights selflessly for his country. And then perhaps as we move on to our second point, although initially presented as brave and noble, Shakespeare moves Macbeth or changes Macbeth, or Macbeth himself is influenced by the witches and his wife. And then perhaps regardless of his bravery and nobility, by the end of the play, Macbeth has completely changed and decides to take fate into his own hands. Something is similar to that, I guess, to show that progression or the character arc and development. So let's remind ourselves of what that might look like. We then have our initial response, our progressive response, and then the resolution or the result of those responses. But what might the thesis statement look like? A good, clear thesis statement. Well, let's have a look. Okay, so let's argue and pretend that our focus is fate, the question we had at the start. Try and think of these 3 areas when constructing your thesis statement. What is the writer doing? How are they doing it? And why are they doing it? What's the purpose and the message? So I guess for this, your thesis could look something like this. Now, this could be 1 or 2 sentences or 3 sentences, no more than that really. But this is what it could look like if we're focusing on the what the writer's doing, how the writer's doing it, and perhaps why, the intention. Through the powerful influence of the witches' fateful prophecies and his wife's Machiavellian manipulation, Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a character who relies on fate. Most powerfully, as the play develops and the prophecies come true, Macbeth's downfall leads to his own tragic death, emphasising Shakespeare's message that fate is arguably set for us all by an ultimate power. He continues to suggest that by disrupting this natural order because of a selfish ambition, it could lead to turmoil and death. So I guess it's important to think about what, how, and why when constructing our thesis statements. And like I said before, they could be 2 or perhaps 3 sentences long. They don't need to be any longer than that. But what's interesting is that we can take a thesis like this, or a thesis that we write really well in class, and learn it to tweak and adapt for pretty much any question or any theme that may come up. So I've done this again, following the what, how, why structure and some of the similar style of sentence types, and tried to rewrite my thesis, but with a different focus. So for argument's sake, we'll pretend that the question focused on the witches or the influence of the witches. So again, let's remind ourselves that we need to follow the what, the how, and the why. And let's see what that might sound like as a thesis statement, using similar sentences to the ones before. Through the attractive promise of being king and the protection of a charmed life, Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a character who relies on the witches and their influence. Most powerfully, as the play develops and the prophecies come true, Macbeth's downfall leads to his own tragic death, emphasising Shakespeare's message that, although an important catalyst to the turmoil of a kingdom, the witches are not ultimately the reason for Macbeth's tragic downfall, and by our naturally going against our own morals, we too could have a tragic end. So again, just reminding ourselves of the essay structure, a good, clear thesis statement that kind of generally states what your essay is going to be about. Then your topic sentences and supporting evidence in your paragraphs that follow, focusing on perhaps elements from the beginning, the middle and the end-ish in a way, and then your conclusion by the end, sort of summarising and restating some of those main points. So before you go away and have a go at writing some of these essays, let's just summarise and give a couple of top tips to remember. First, you must read the question carefully. Whether there's 1 or 2 questions, you really need to look at every focus point or concept of that question. It's not just going to be a character or a theme, perhaps it's merged together. So it's really important to read it and focus all of your points from that. Second, planning. Thinking about the theme or the character and the arc, starting with the beginning elements, the middle elements, and perhaps things that happen towards the end or how it develops towards the end. If it is a Shakespeare question, you will get an extract. It's important to place that extract within your essay plan. So for example, if my extract was from the middle of the play or kind of the middle-ish of the play, then that might become my middle point or the second part of my line of argument. Similarly, if the extract's taken towards the end, then that will become my final point, and I'll start with other ideas from the beginning and the middle and the end. So I still follow that structure, even if there is or isn't an extract to begin with. Next, we need to start with a clear thesis statement, following the why, the how, and the what elements. Fourth, we need to include at least 3 clear points. Again, like I said, something from the beginning, the middle, and the end. We need to choose references carefully for our paragraphs. Quotations, stage directions, all of those are really important. Be careful of context and giving us bolt-on context. I think particularly for Shakespeare, we don't need to go to town with the context because it's not relevant and it doesn't really strengthen our points, but it is definitely something to be aware of. And finally, make sure you develop and analyse methods. And remember that a method is not necessarily a technique. We do not want to feature spot throughout our essays. Think more of the big ideas and the overall concepts that the author is trying to portray, as opposed to the techniques that they have used. Thanks for listening. I hope that helped you.